In the winter of 1823, Théodore Géricault set up a mirror in his sick room and began to paint. He had spent years borrowing severed heads from Paris morgues, studying how death changes a face. Now he was painting his own. The portrait that resulted hangs in Rouen today, and viewers who see it often look away quickly. Something about the eyes, one focused, one failing. Something about the way the skull seems visible beneath the skin. It doesn't look like a self-portrait. It looks like an autopsy of a man still breathing. Géricault was 31 years old when he painted it. He would be dead within months. But this isn't a painting about dying tragically or beautifully. This is a painting about watching yourself disappear and refusing to look away. The painting hangs in the Musée des Beaux-Arts in Rouen. Oil on canvas, modest in size, undated but assigned to the final months of Géricault's life in 1823 or early 1824. Sometimes called self-portrait, sometimes simply head of a man. The vagueness fits. This asserts nothing about identity or achievement. It only documents. A man's face emerges from darkness. The background is muddy, undefined, oppressive. No studio visible, no window, no furniture. The world has contracted to a single point. This is the visual grammar of isolation, the sick room where time stops, and the only view is inward. He wears a soft, shapeless cap, not the formal hat or cravat that signaled status in 19th century portraiture, not the studio coat artists wore to announce their profession. A bonnet de police, a sleeping cap, the uniform of the bedridden invalid. The detail is a confession. This man is not working in his studio. He is confined to bed. The face itself demands attention. Skin stretched tight over prominent cheekbones, temples sunken deeply. The skeletal structure pushes through as if the flesh is thinning, failing to contain what lies beneath. The lips pressed together, corners turned down, not in sadness, but in the grimace of someone enduring physical pain, holding still just long enough to finish the work. And the eyes. One appears focused, the pupil distinct. The other droops, shadowed, the eyelids sagging as if the muscle has weakened. The asymmetry is subtle but unmistakable once you see it. Théodore Géricault was born wealthy in 1791, came of age during Napoleon's wars, and achieved fame at 27 with a single painting, The Raft of the Medusa. The canvas depicted shipwreck survivors driven to cannibalism, a massive, scandalous work that established his reputation. To paint it, he needed to understand what death does to flesh. So he visited the Paris morgues and made arrangements, severed limbs, decapitated heads. He brought them back to his studio and kept them while he worked. Under the bed, in corners, studying the stages of decomposition. How skin yellows, then greens, how features collapse. The clinical process of rot. He was not morbid in the theatrical sense. He was methodical. Death was a problem to solve through observation. He sketched guillotined criminals. He visited prisons and asylums. He turned suffering into subject matter, always maintaining the cool distance of the anatomist studying a specimen. His life changed suddenly. A riding accident, possibly more than one, the accounts conflict, injured his spine. An abscess developed. The young cavalier whose entire identity rested on physical prowess and horsemanship became an invalid. The final year of his life was spent largely bedridden, his body failing in ways he could observe but not control. The likely cause reconstructed by physicians analyzing this portrait and his death mask decades later. A spinal tumor, possibly combined with tertiary syphilis. In the 1820s, syphilis was the silent epidemic, shameful, incurable, degenerative. It moved in stages, dormant for years before the final assault on the nervous system. The late stage brought tabes dorsalis, spinal cord degeneration, loss of motor control, shooting pains, and eventual paralysis. The treatments available, mercury compounds, cauterization of the spine, were nearly as brutal as the disease. In the months just before painting this self-portrait, Géricault had been working on another commission. The psychiatrist, Dr. Georget, hired him to paint portraits of asylum patients, studies of individuals diagnosed with different forms of madness. Géricault spent weeks in the asylum, observing, learning the visual signatures of mental collapse, the vacant stare. The facial asymmetry is caused by neurological damage, the subtle signs that consciousness had detached from reality. He learned how to diagnose by looking at faces. Then he went home, set up his mirror, and looked at his own. Return to the face now, knowing what came before. The drooping eyelid, ptosis in medical terminology, appears when the muscles controlling the eyelid weaken. Neurosyphilis attacks motor function. The disease doesn't affect both sides equally. One eye opens normally, the other begins to fail. Géricault wasn't painting an emotion, he was documenting a symptom. But the direction of the gaze carries its own weight. The eyes don't look outward at a viewer. They stare into the mirror itself, or perhaps through it. The focus is inward, searching. After spending months painting the insane, Géricault had reason to fear what syphilis does to the mind. The disease doesn't only paralyze the body, it erodes personality, causes delusions, strips away the architecture of self. So he checked. Each time he looked in the mirror, he was performing an examination, looking for the signs he had just learned to recognize in the asylum: the loss of focus, the vacant expression, the moment when the person disappears and something else inhabits the face. The intensity of the stare comes from this: not vanity, not artistic contemplation. Diagnosis. He is simultaneously patient and physician, specimen and observer. The question behind the eyes: am I still here? Modern physicians examining the painting identify what Géricault was recording. The facies hippocratica, the medical term for the face of impending death, characterized by sunken temples and visible bone structure due to loss of subcutaneous fat. The ptosis suggests nerve damage. The overall presentation is consistent with tabes dorsalis in its advanced stages. The painting functions as a clinical document, not a metaphor for suffering, a record of specific observable symptoms. The shoulders barely exist. A few brushstrokes suggest their presence, then they dissolve into the muddy background. The torso is even less defined, hinted at, then abandoned. Only the head remains fully rendered, solid and detailed, floating in darkness like something preserved in a specimen jar. Géricault had painted severed heads before. As studies for the raft of the Medusa, he worked from guillotined criminals, heads detached and studied as objects. In this final self-portrait, he performs the same operation on himself. The body fades. Existence narrows to consciousness alone. Awareness trapped in a vessel it can no longer control, observing its own failure without the ability to intervene. The color palette reinforces the dissolution. Almost no color anywhere: blacks, browns, muddy earth tones. Géricault used bitumen heavily, a tar-based pigment that creates rich, deep shadows. But bitumen has a chemical flaw. It never fully dries. Over time, it darkens further and develops cracks. The painting itself is chemically unstable, continuing to decay slowly even now, centuries later. The technical choice mirrors the subject. Both the body depicted and the paint depicting it refuse to stabilize. Both are in ongoing states of breakdown. The nightcap, the fading body, the decaying medium, every element points to the same conclusion. This is not a portrait asserting identity. This is a portrait documenting erasure. In 1823, Romantic painting favored beautiful suffering. Eugène Delacroix painted himself as a windswept, brooding figure, tragic but handsome, pain rendered aesthetic. The Romantic movement required that artist suffering be ennobling, that decline carry grandeur. Even death was supposed to be poetic. Géricault painted the opposite: no windblown drama, no heroic profile, no dignified melancholy, just the blunt fact of a body failing, the sunken temples, the drooping eyelid, the grimace of someone in chronic pain. He painted what was actually happening to him, not what convention expected. The painting was never intended for public view. It remained private, too uncomfortable for salon audiences accustomed to the polished idealism of academic work. Friends who visited Géricault in his final months reported being shocked by his physical transformation. The wasting, the emaciation, the speed of the decline. The portrait captured that reality without softening it. After his death at 32, others tried to reshape the narrative. The romantic myth machine wanted tragic genius, beautiful waste, poetic loss, but the painting refused to cooperate. It was too honest. It showed what they wanted hidden, that dying is ugly, that disease humiliates, that the body's betrayal cannot be made aesthetic. The refusal itself becomes a form of rebellion. Even bedridden, even failing, Géricault maintained his commitment to observation over fantasy, documentation over comfort. He would not lie to the canvas, not even at the end. Modern viewers often describe feeling unsettled by the painting without being able to articulate why. The face reads as human, but registers as wrong. The asymmetry of the eyes, the skeletal structure too close to the surface, the sense that the person depicted is already partially absent, still technically alive but no longer fully present. The painting captures a liminal state, not alive in any robust sense, not yet dead, suspended in the space between, with full awareness of the trajectory. That awareness, the consciousness that observes its own dissolution, is what creates the discomfort. Physicians analyzing the work in recent decades have cataloged what Géricault documented. The facies hippocratica indicates severe wasting. The ptosis suggests neurological involvement. The overall presentation is consistent with late-stage syphilitic degeneration. The portrait functions as medical evidence, a diagnostic image that happens to be painted rather than photographed. The work anticipates later developments in art. Francis Bacon's distorted figures in the 20th century, bodies rendered not as they appear but as they feel. Visceral, psychologically weighted, prioritizing sensation over representation. Géricault reached that territory first, though not through aesthetic choice. He painted sensation because sensation was what remained. Pain, weakness, the body's revolt against the mind still inhabiting it. Géricault died in 1824. Historical records place his death sometime in the months following this portrait's completion. He was bedridden at the end, body consumed by disease, in constant pain. But he continued working as long as he physically could. Everything else had been taken: his health, his mobility, the identity he built as a dashing equestrian and celebrated artist, the future he might have had. But the brush remained under his command. The ability to observe, to document, to refuse to look away, that remained. The painting represents his final act of agency, not a statement of who he was, but a record of what was happening. Painted with the same clinical precision he once applied to morgue specimens and guillotined criminals, he now turned inward. The predator is studying his own predation. The observer becomes the observed. Every person understands the fear this painting captures. The mirror test. The morning when your reflection shows something changed, something wrong, is the first evidence that you are not permanent. Géricault's final self-portrait documents that moment with unsparing clarity. He saw the skull emerging, the eyes are failing, the body is dissolving, and he painted exactly what he found, without flinching, without seeking comfort in beautiful lies. The painting still hangs in Rouen. The bitumen continues its slow chemical decay, darkening and cracking as the years pass. A document of death that paradoxically remains alive in its refusal to console or reassure. Géricault's last confrontation with his own mortality, preserved in the moment he confirmed his worst fears and chose documentation over denial. He painted what he knew was coming. He painted it honestly, and he left us this, proof that even when everything else fails, the choice to witness, to see clearly and record truthfully, remains. The final defiance of an artist who spent his life studying death, and in the end, brought that same unflinching gaze to bear on his own disappearance.